Okay, so welcome to the 2020 East Poultney Day webinar. I know that this is definitely not what you would be used to if you're a frequent East Poultney Day goer, but we find ourselves in uncertain and strange times, so calls for uncertain and strange measures. But we're really honored to have Carrie Brown be our keynote speaker this year for East Poultney Day, and she's graciously allowed us to have this online webinar with her and to record this so that we can have this on our website in the future and others can visit and watch this down the road. So we're really glad to have her with us. This talk is sponsored by the Vermont Humanities Council, and Carrie Brown is a Vermont Humanities Council speaker. She earned a PhD from the University of Virginia and specialized in connections between American literature and folklore, but she also has a broader focus in the field of American studies. She's worked on a wide range of topics, ranging from the history of aviation to the culture of New England towns, to the work of men, women, and children in American factories. And she's been a museum curator and exhibit developer for more than 25 years. She's been the author of many books, magazine articles, and exhibition catalogs. So we're really happy to have her to share her experience and to give us this talk entitled Rosie's Mom, Forgotten Women of the First World War. And we're really honored to have Carrie join us today to give this talk, especially given the significance of this year, which is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. So we're really happy to have her here. And Carrie, please join us and take it away.
Okay, are you seeing me?
Yes.
Okay, good. We have a little bit of a time lag here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I wish I could be with all of you in person. This would be a whole lot more fun for all of us if we could, but we will press ahead as we must. I'm going to share my screen, and that will take me just a moment so that you can see my slideshow. And I think you'll also still maybe be able to see a little bit of me. So let's see if we can make this work. All right. Jamie, can you just let me know for sure that you can see my screen?
Looks good.
Okay, good. All right, thank you. Well, so let's get started. Jamie did not mention that this talk I'm going to be giving this morning is based on a book that I wrote called Rosie's Mom. If there's some aspects of the topic that intrigue you that I don't cover, you can probably get your local library to get a copy of the book, or I think you can still get it on Amazon. In August of 1920, 100 years ago, women finally earned the right to vote in America. It was in the aftermath of the First World War. That long struggle for suffrage came to an end. Now, the story of votes for women is long and complicated, but today we're going to focus on really just one aspect of it, and that is the role of working women during the First World War. And I hope that by the end of the hour this morning, I will have convinced you that these women made a difference. We all know about Rosie the Riveter and Wendy the Welder in World War II, but most of us don't realize that a generation earlier, there were women doing war work in American factories and on railroads and so forth. The story of this First World War is, of course, like the story of suffrage, a much bigger topic than we are going to cover. But let me just briefly say it was a terrible, devastating war. There were 11 million deaths, military deaths. There were 7 million civilian deaths. There were probably 20 million people wounded. At the end of the war, there was social and political upheaval. During the war, there was ethnic cleansing, what we would call genocide or ethnic cleansing today. There was the introduction of chemical warfare, and at the end of the war, there was a redrawing of national boundaries that left countries, especially in the Middle East, in a very unstable situation, and we still struggle with that today. So, as I said, the story of the war is also much larger than what we can cover today. We're going to talk about the role of the working women, and what difference did they make? What were their experiences? What was their experience like, and what did they contribute? And then what difference did it make in the long run? We've forgotten these women, and maybe we shouldn't have, because I'm going to argue that they did make a difference. So here, as I said, who were they? What did they do? What were their working conditions like? And what did they achieve? And this is a welder. In the First World War, that women did learn how to do welding. And so, as I said, Rosie the Riveter and Wendy the welder were not the first. I learned very quickly when I started studying this topic that in order to understand the significance of what these women did, you need to know, excuse me, who they were and where they came from. So women, of course, had always worked. They worked in homes, they worked on farms, and then in the late 1700s, early 1800s, as the factory system developed, they began to work outside of the home in factories. Much of what they did when they began to work outside the home was what had traditionally been women's work, spinning and weaving, but now it's done on a much larger scale. Machinery had been developed that could make the worker much more efficient and produce a whole lot more of every product. So they began to work in textile shops and food preparation, clothing manufacture. Some of them were, of course, domestic servants, but women had been working for many years. Mostly in the by the end of the 1800s, the women who worked in factories were largely young and unmarried, although of course there were always women who were married who needed to work because the families needed the income. But many women only worked for a few years, and when they were young, and then they would get married, and the ideal was that you would then leave the paid workforce. So in addition to the development of the factory system, there was another change happening. In the period 1865 to 1916, 27 million people arrived in this country, mostly from the European countries. And they often, they were Irish, Polish, Italian. In the far west, there were Chinese immigrants. And in this period, as they were coming in, many of them, of course, didn't speak English. So they had a language barrier. Many of them had inappropriate work skills for the jobs that they were able to get. Maybe they were farmers and they needed to learn to work in a factory. Maybe they were fine seamstresses and needlewomen, and they needed to go to work in the textile mills. So they often had inappropriate skills, and there was a lot of prejudice against the immigrants. So they often ended up at the very bottom of the economic ladder and doing the most difficult and worst and dirtiest and lowest paid jobs. So the situation was not great. Also, many of them had very large families, and wages were so low that often children had to go to work at the age of 11, 12, 13. This is a little spinner in North Carolina. This is one of the famous Lewis Hine photographs. Lewis Hine worked for the National Child Labor Committee, and they were trying to get child labor abolished and get regulations that would keep these children out of the factories. But there they were, because earning only pennies a day, they could still help put food on the family's table. Lest you think this was only a Southern thing, this is a cotton mill in Vermont in 1910. Those are pretty young looking children, and they're in the front row, and they're working very long days, 6 days a week. And this is Manchester, New Hampshire. Now, those are pretty tough looking kids, and it was a rough life. We did find, if you study these children 20 years later, or even in this case, it's 1909. If you study them only 6 or 8 years later, you find that many of the young men were found unfit for military service because their health was so poor. The young women, if you look at them 20 years later, you find that they had low fertility. It was not a healthy environment working in these factories. Tenement sweatshops. You all have heard of tenement sweatshops. A tenement is simply an apartment building, and yet you could rent an apartment and you could cram tables and sewing machines in and cram workers in there and keep them working close quarters, stuffy conditions, and working very long, hard hours for, again, pennies a day. We also need to think about what was called homework. Homework in these days was not what we think of as homework today. We had young children. Well, you would have one person, an older child, or the mother would go to a place to pick up work that could be done as piecework. These children are making artificial flowers for ladies' hats. And Lewis Hines' caption on this photo is, "The little one on the left is not yet 4 years, yet she works irregularly on flowers all day and sometimes until 8 at night." Now, so the social situation here is that these women were doing what had traditionally been women's work, and children had often worked alongside their mother or played alongside their mothers as the mothers were working. And so there was very little interest in the question of whether this was safe or healthy for the women and the children. There were attempts at reform. Sorry, I want to stick with this slide. There were attempts at reform, but whenever laws were passed that tried to restrict hours or regulate working conditions for women and for children, they were challenged in the courts. And the ethos of the day was simply that the relationship between an employer and an employee was a one-to-one personal thing, and the government had no business regulating that in a free economy. So the laws were often struck down in the courts. Finally, in 1908, the Supreme Court upheld a law in Oregon that protected women, allowed the states to regulate their hours on the theory that they had to protect the mothers, what they called the mothers of the race, that being the human race. So if you wanted women to be fit for childbearing, you needed to not work them to such an extent when they were 12, 13, 15. In New York State in 1912, there was finally a limiting of the work week, and it was cut back to 54 hours. So this was a big deal, getting a maximum work week of 54 hours for women. But again, there were still challenges to these wars, or to these laws. In 1913, the stock market crashed and banks failed, businesses closed. There were bands of unemployed men roaming the streets in Oregon and California. In New York and Detroit and Philadelphia, the public charities announced that they could not keep up with the demand for food and shelter and clothing for the unemployed. There was violence in Colorado. In Copper Country in Michigan, there was a 9-month-long miners' strike, and that's what this photo is showing, is the miners' strike in Michigan. It lasted 9 months and it ended in defeat. So times were really tough in this country in 1913 and 1914. It was really a severe recession, severe unemployment, and extreme poverty among many people. In August of 1914, then the war was declared, and that immediately had an impact on the United States because it cut off immigration, it cut off, and it also cut off the need for exports because the European economy just sort of shut down and began to focus on the war. That didn't last for very long. This is August 1914. Early in 1915, American factories began getting orders from European powers for war material. Now, we were technically neutral at the time, so we could supply both sides. So there were orders for armored cars and shrapnel shells, arms, small arms, large arms, ammunition. And suddenly, there was a labor shortage in this country, in the factories and in the towns where war materials could be made. I'm going to give you one example of that. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, the Union Metallic Cartridge Company had merged with Remington Arms to create a company called Remington UMC, Union Metallic Cartridge. And suddenly they had orders from European countries for ammunition, much greater orders than they could handle with their traditional workforce, with the workforce of men that they had. And you can't just all of a sudden bring a whole lot of new men into a town the size of Bridgeport, because where are you going to put them, and where are you going to put their families? And you have them coming, they need housing, they need schools. So the people at Remington UMC had this brilliant idea that suddenly that they could make it possible for women to work in their factory. They had never invited women to work in their factory before. For women, Bridgeport, Connecticut was what they called a white goods town. Now, white goods is simply a polite term for ladies' underwear. So they were making ladies' underwear, specifically right across the street from Remington UMC, there was a corset factory. And suddenly it became known that women could get jobs making shells over across the street, and at much higher wages than they were earning making corsets. So the women got up, they walked across the street, and they got jobs. And we always wondered what happened to the corset. And now maybe we know, because here they are, not making corsets, they are making shells. Now notice that each of these women has an exhaust hood. I can make my mouse work here. You see the exhaust hood. Here are the boxes of shells, and she is filling shells. They are dealing with pretty toxic chemicals, and so these exhaust hoods supposedly are removing some of the fumes from the work that they're doing. So women then began doing work that they had not done before. This woman is using a grinding machine, and I want you to just look at this picture and imagine that you are an OSHA inspector of today and think about what is wrong with this picture. Well, she does have her hair tied back. It doesn't look real securely fastened, but she's got these long flowing skirts and big sleeves, and this is not a good way for a woman to be working at a machine like that. This is an extremely powerful machine, very dangerous. Now keep in mind that the spinning machines and the weaving machines in the textile mills were also not safe machines, but they were always considered to be women's work. And so women worked those machines with their hair down and with the long skirts and the big sleeves, and no one really thought much of it, even though there were many injuries in those. But what we have now is a situation where women are doing traditionally men's work. They're working different machines, they're producing different things. And so people began to think about, well, is this really a safe environment? So one of the first things that happened was the introduction of a new garment called womanalls. And this was the first time really that any but women in American culture could be seen in public wearing, and a respectable woman could be seen in public wearing anything that made it clear that she had two lower limbs. Generally, women, just a respectable woman would not do this. Now you may say to me, well, Carrie, what about the bicycle craze of the 1890s and Amelia Bloomer and the Bloomers? Well, Amelia Bloomer was not a nice girl. She was not a respectable lady. And so now, though, we begin to see people realizing, okay, we have a different situation here. Now, I promise you this is not a lecture about fashion, but I'm using fashion or women's clothing to illustrate the point that people are beginning to think about women's safety in a different way because they are doing different work in different places. These women are making fuses at the Gray and Davis Company in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And again, you can see that they actually have two legs and they even have ankles. The one in the back left, you can see she's still got on those ridiculous pointy-toed high-heeled shoes, but at least she is wearing safer clothes. Her sleeves are up above the elbow. They're wearing caps. And there's some attempt being made and some consideration being made about their safety. So the lung diseases in the textile factory had been there, crushed and broken hands, hair caught in machinery had all been there. But there was the perception that that was appropriate work for women, and we now have them doing work that is not appropriate. Now, I want to talk briefly about another social upheaval that was going on. In the South after Reconstruction, the conditions for Black workers in the South were really very little better than slavery. But suddenly in 1916, there were jobs available in the North. African-American workers had never been welcome in the factories in the North before the war, but suddenly we have this big labor shortage, and also immigration from Europe has been cut off. So all those non-English speaking unskilled laborers who were coming and filling the factories and allowing factory owners to hire at very low wages, now those people are not coming anymore. So you began to see people heading north, Black people heading north to the meatpacking plants in Chicago, to the railroads. These organizations began to welcome Black workers. Men and women both could find jobs in the North. These women are just cleaning the track. These are not young women. They probably lived in boxcar communities. working conditions were terrible, living conditions were often terrible. In cities, they were living in very poor housing as well, but the men could vote. They were away from the constant threat of violence in the South, and the freedom from that violence and from the degree of oppression in the South, and the concept that they could vote, they could go to the YMCA and the YWCA, they had clubs, brought people to the North, brought Black people to the North. And between the years 1915 and 1920, 500,000 African Americans moved from the South to the North. The jobs were difficult and dirty most of the time. Some women found jobs in factories. I want you to look carefully at this one. These women are sewing in a factory. I'm actually making gaiters. If you have seen pictures of the World War I soldiers, you know that they had these things wrapped around their lower legs called puttees, they were called at the time. But notice in this factory, the women on the other side of that barrier, those are white women back there, but there's no mixing of the races. And very few Black women got jobs that are as clean as this particular factory, but they're still not mixing with the white workers. So the Great Migration lasted through the Second World War, and that is really how the majority of the African Americans who now live in the North got here. It was their ancestors, starting in 1916, were coming north for factory jobs during the war. 1915, this was the sinking of the Lusitania. The US began to move away from neutrality and toward war. And in April of 1917, the United States entered the war. Now, up until now, women were filling mostly new jobs created by new war work to supply the European powers and also to supply a buildup of arms in the United States in the lead up to our joining the war. But now also there's a shortage of young men because the young men are heading off to war. So there are even more jobs for women in the factories at this time. More than 10,000 women were making gas masks. People began to figure out that if you could pack cigarettes or candies or corsets, you could make or pack war materials. If you could work in a department store, you could work in the supply room at the Navy Yard at Puget Sound. Women were also being trained to use other machinery, as you saw in some of the earlier photos. Cutting bevel gears is skilled work. Now, this woman probably did not have all the skills of a trained machinist who had started his apprenticeship at 14 and gone through years of training, but she has been trained to do the skilled work of cutting bevel gears on this gear cutting machine. And this was highly skilled work. Women were working in the aircraft factories. These women are assembling aircraft motors at the Dayton Wright Airplane Company. And they were doing outdoor work. Now, I never knew that you needed to wipe an engine, but apparently you do. And these are engine wipers in Great Falls, Montana. So women, of course, had done hard physical outdoor labor on farms before, but now they're doing it on the railroads. If you look at the faces here, they're very proud of what they're doing. They know they're helping the war effort, and they're doing work that they've never done before, working in places they've never been welcome to work before. Now, just because there's a labor shortage, suddenly labor relations did not become peaceful. You had before the war, many strikes, much labor unrest, violent put downs by private guards brought in to break up strikes. The situation in industry in America leading up to the war was quite violent, quite volatile, and quite unreliable. Lots of factory shutdowns, unexpected times, long strikes, and so forth. Suddenly, we don't have peace in industry in the United States, and there are reasons for that. One is that while the wages for skilled workers were going up, skilled men were going up, and wages for women went up some because they got into these slightly better paying jobs, but inflation was very high. So you also have wages really hardly keeping up with inflation. And workers are being asked now to buy war bonds, they're producing war goods, they're sending their young men off to war, and they're watching some of the big companies make huge war profits. And so they were still not happy. There was still a lot of unrest. In Braddock, Pennsylvania, which is east of Pittsburgh, there was a strike that started at a Westinghouse mill. Eventually, it involved 4 area plants, and 36,000 workers were on strike in May of 1916. This was just before the war. The same thing continued to happen right after we entered the war. There were still many strikes, many shutdowns of factories. In this case, the National Guard was called in, martial law was declared in the city. And so, as I said, these things were continuing after the war began. Now, this is a problem for the US government because we have a war to fight. And you can't be fighting a war if you have a strike on the railroad, and you can't get materials to the factories, and you can't get finished goods to the ships that need to take them overseas. So it was a serious problem that needed to be solved. How are you going to keep the economy running at top speed when you have all of this labor unrest and all of this strife between the factory owners and the employees? So the national government did several things. One is it created a war labor board to arbitrate grievances. So if you had a problem in your factory that was looking like it might lead to a strike or a lockdown, a lockout, and you had a government contract, you had to bring government negotiators in to settle the situation before there was a strike. You had to present your case to the War Labor Board. Both sides would present their case. The War Labor Board would impose a solution so that the factory would not shut down. And you had to abide by this solution if you wanted to keep your government contracts. So that was one thing, the War Labor Board. The second thing was the government took control of the railroads temporarily, so that the government could control the railroads and avoid the kinds of strikes that were shutting down the railroads in the war, in the years leading up to the war. Thirdly, they set up agencies to oversee the work of women, because we now have all of these women doing unaccustomed work in unaccustomed places. We have this growing realization that it's not a safe place for women to be in many of these factories, and that the long, grueling hours are not healthy for them. And therefore, we need there was a perception that we should have women's bureaus overseeing the work of these women. So the Department of Labor, the Army Ordnance Department, and the Railroad Administration all set up subdivisions for overseeing the work of women. One of the most surprising things they did was they put women at the head of these bureaus. At the Department of Labor, they created a women's bureau, and they set at the head of it 2 women, Mary Anderson and Mary Van Cleek. Mary Anderson was a union organizer. She'd worked her way up through the boot and shoe union. Mary Van Cleek was a scholar who had spent her career studying the conditions of working women. What did they do? What hours did they work? What did they eat? Where did they live? So she knew a whole lot about conditions of working women and what was healthy and what was not. So the 2 Marys were set at the head of the labor, in the Labor Department of the Women's Bureau. They were supposed to look out for protecting health and safety. They were supposed to consider the comfort of the women, both physical and psychological. They were supposed to make sure there were opportunities for women, and they were supposed to be trying to get equal pay for equal work. They were asked by their boss at the Department of Labor to come up with a list of what factories would be safe for women to work in. Well, Mary Anderson and Mary Van Cleek had their own subversive agenda. They were asked to put together this list of industries, and they said, no, we are not going to put together a list of industries where it's safe for women to work. We're going to give you a list of conditions. And if a factory can meet those safety and health conditions, then they can hire women. Because Mary Anderson and Mary Van Cleek realized that they had this once in a lifetime opportunity. They thought it would be once in a lifetime to improve workers' conditions for all workers, not just for women. And if they just came up with a list of safe industries, first of all, it would be a very short list. And secondly, they wouldn't do anything for the men workers. So they said, we will create a list of conditions. And if a factory can meet those conditions, then they can hire women. So at one point, I want to talk about just one example. The chemical industries in New York, at Niagara Falls, had always been considered hazardous. Now we think of Niagara Falls as this beautiful, spectacular natural wonder. We go there on vacation, we take our children there, we go on honeymoons there, and yet that was a center for the chemical industries because there's a tremendous amount of water power available at that part of the river. So the chemical industries had always been thought to be unsafe. In 1912, New York state officials had found unhealthy conditions in those industries, but nothing was done about it. But they were making acids for explosives, they were making storage batteries, they were using a variety of caustic and poisonous chemicals. So in July of 1918, the question came up of night work for women. Now, night work was always questionable for women because everybody knew that if a woman was working the night shift, very likely she would work the night shift and she would go home and she would fix breakfast for the family and she would get the children off to school and she would do some laundry and some cooking and then she would sleep for a few hours and then she would get up and go and work the night shift and get very little sleep in the process. So night work was quite suspect for women. And so the Niagara Falls industries wanted to put women on the night shift. They said to Mary Van Cleek and Mary Anderson at the Department of Labor, can we do this? And Mary Van Cleek sent out examiners, inspectors. And here's what they decided. If you will put impermeable flooring on the floors so that all of these caustic chemicals don't soak into wooden floors and just sit there. If you will put in a bubbling drinking fountain instead of just a bucket for women and a dipper for people to drink out of. If you'll provide soap and water where they can wash their hands regularly. If you'll set up eating areas away from the work areas where the chemicals are. If you'll rotate the workers from the most hazardous jobs to the less hazardous jobs and move them around. And if you will have a physician on staff, then yes, you can put women on the night shift. Now you see, this has nothing to do with providing daycare or providing women with enough hours in the day to sleep. It all has to do with safety in the factory, and those safety changes affected all of the workers in that factory. So this, as I said, was sort of the subversive agenda of the two women at the head of the Women's Bureau. I need to talk a little bit, just briefly, about the social conditions. The men in the factories did not welcome the women. There were some trades, including welding, in which if you taught a woman to do the skill, you could be kicked out of your union. There were shops where men harassed the women seriously to the point where the women and men had to be given separate entrances to the factory and put on staggered arrival times and so forth. Men had good reason for not wanting the women. Women always brought down the wages. Whenever women entered a profession, the prestige of that profession went down and the wages went down. So the men feared for their jobs. Not only because there was always wage discrimination against women, but also because these women, many of them who had been doing piecework in the factories, were speed demons, and they would come in and they would work at a breakneck pace, and the men felt they would make them look bad and that they would change the pace of the factory. The skilled workmen had a certain amount of control over the pace of their work, and they had strong unions. The women had no strong unions. So the men were very threatened, and they really did not like having the women in the factories. I want to talk briefly. I've just spoken about what the government was doing at the Railroad Administration, the Department of Ordnance, and the Bureau of Labor. But there were also some private organizations that were working to improve conditions for women. The YWCA was one of them. They set up dormitories, they set up reading rooms, and they had sewing classes and cooking classes for the workers in the evenings, because a lot of women had begun to move to new places, and there was this concept that if you didn't give them plenty to do and keep a close eye on them, these young girls working in the factories would get into trouble. And so in order to keep them out of the movie theaters and the dance halls and the clubs, there were activities set up by the YWCA for them. there were also other organizations. I want to talk just a little bit about the African American club women. Many of the African American women who were involved in suffrage got their starts working in other places. Nannie Helen Burroughs is the woman pictured in the blow up at the right. She is also the woman holding the banner on the left of the larger photograph here. Her parents had been enslaved in the South before the war. She herself managed to get an education. She became a member of the National Baptist Convention, and through that organization, and with donations from African American women and children, she tried very hard not to accept donations from wealthy white people. She wanted this to be a grassroots Black movement. She set up a school, the National Training School for Women and Girls, which was a training school for Black women and girls. She established it in 1919. And this school taught both vocational and academic subjects, including, but they were taught dressmaking and power machine operation, but also music and language and literature, and there were physical education classes. They had a basketball team. So many of these women were trained to do traditional service jobs, cooking and housekeeping and laundry and so forth. But she also emphasized jobs outside the sphere of traditional women's work and outside the sphere of traditional Black women's work. And this school was really very successful. Another organization that was working to improve conditions for women was the Women's Trade Union League. And I have to talk to you about Rose Schneiderman. She was a Russian Jewish immigrant and worked as a union organizer. She did a lot of work with the white goods trade and in New York and in Boston. Born in 1882, she lived to 1972 when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire disaster occurred. And a day or two later, there was a memorial gathering in New York. She gave the most passionate and affecting speech of the day. She began, as Nannie Helen Burroughs also began, to work for women's suffrage. We're finally now getting to the suffrage movement. Many of the women working for suffrage over decades and decades were middle class and upper class women, because working women didn't have time to be on picket lines and to do organizing and to lobby their congressmen. They're busy working. Remember, they're working 12, 14, 15 hours a day. When New York in 1909 passed that law, it limited the women's work week to 54 hours a week. So working women didn't have time to be working on suffrage. It was largely a movement of middle class and upper class women. This is college day on the picket line. Now, when the US started supporting the war, the powers that were perceived to be on the side of freedom in Europe, American women began to say, Mr. Wilson, you are working for freedom in Europe. What about us? We cannot vote. You see in the signs here, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? So they're picketing the White House. And Woodrow Wilson was quite slow to come out in favor of women's suffrage. You can see here the banners that they're wearing. This is the University of Kansas, University of Missouri, Washington College, Leland Stanford, Bryn Mawr, Swarthmore, Vassar. I don't know why this woman doesn't have a name on her banner. Maybe she's got it on backwards by mistake. We don't know where she's from. Oberlin College. So these are young women, again, upper middle class women probably, who are going to these colleges and universities, and they're picketing the White House saying, Mr. Wilson, what are you going to do for us? Because we're fighting for European freedom. What about freedom in the United States? Meanwhile, Rose Schneiderman, let's go back to Rose Schneiderman, got an interview in the White House with Woodrow Wilson, and she took with her a small group of working women who were working on the war effort. And she looks up at President Wilson. She was this tiny little woman, about 4 feet 10 inches tall. She was one of those women who, when she wanted to give a harangue about union organizing and workers' rights on the street corner, she didn't stand on a soapbox. She had a little step ladder she took around with her. And she went to President Wilson with this little group of working women. And she said to him, Mr. President, these women are helping you win the war, and yet they cannot vote. So inside the White House, that's Rose Schneiderman. Outside the White House, we have the college picketers. Finally, in September of 1930, Woodrow Wilson did, 1918, September 30th, 1918, Woodrow Wilson did come out in support of women's suffrage. And here's what he said. We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right? This war could not have been fought either by the other nations engaged or by America if it had not been for the services of the women. So the 19th Amendment finally passed both houses of Congress in the spring of 1919. And then it needed to be ratified, and it would be more than a year before enough states ratified it to put it into effect. And that finally happened in August of 1920. The war ended in November of 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Remember that the United States was in this war for only 18 months. On November 11th, the women at the Frankfurt Arsenal on the night shift were immediately let go. By November 14th, the Curtiss Airplane Company discharged 3,000 people. Union Metallic Cartridge Company in Bridgeport announced a plan to release half of its workforce. And at the Springfield Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts, the layoffs began in November and they ended in May, and they laid off about half of the workforce. Now, this is only reasonable. The war is over. We have no more need for all of those armored vehicles and all the ammunition and the guns and the canned meats from the Chicago meatpacking houses that were going over to feed the soldiers. We had no need for all of that. So of course, it was time to cut back the workforce in all of those factories. But I don't need to tell you who lost their jobs first, because you already know. Women were immediately pushed out of their jobs on the railroads, their jobs in the machine shops. There had been women conductors on trolleys in some of the cities. The trolley conductors were immediately let go. I showed you a little while back a picture of Vivian Wilson at a milling machine. By 1920, Vivian Wilson, I find her in the United States Census in 1920. She's working as a cook. So during the war, she learned this skill of operating a milling machine, a skill that had long been done by very skilled men. She immediately lost her job operating that milling machine. So in the 1920s, fewer than 7% of white married women worked. Many more younger unmarried women worked. About a third of Black women worked in the 1920s. There was new work, and some of it went to women. This is the Edison lamp works. So at the electrical industries, people are now making light bulbs and radios and different electronic devices. And some of those jobs in the factories became available to women. If you've seen pictures of textile mills, you'll see this is a much cleaner, brighter space than a textile mill. One might argue that you need a cleaner space to make light bulbs than you did to make fabrics in the textile mills. But even so, we are seeing some safer conditions and cleaner conditions in the factories. This is clearly the 1920s. You can tell by the short hair and the short dresses. But imagine this, they have a private washroom here, individual stalls, running water in the sinks. And so conditions are changing. And again, that's a tile floor in the bathroom, not a wooden floor. So it's much easier to keep clean. So things are changing. More young women are finishing high school. Again, of course, there was new work also in offices. With the development of machinery like the typewriter, new jobs were opening up for women in what we would now today perhaps call the pink collar sector. So conditions were changing all around. But the point that I would like to make is that much of this change was brought about by the change in women who very boldly left their familiar working places in the textile mills and the sweatshops, to go into these new factories, places they'd never been before, doing jobs they'd never done before, working on big heavy machinery that they've never used and maybe even never seen before. And that concept of, now that we have women working outside their traditional spheres, we need to look at safety conditions. And there is a role, because we're at war, there's a role for the government in regulating and improving those conditions. These changes occurred much more rapidly, much sooner than they might otherwise have occurred, because of the presence of women in those factories. So what difference did it make that these women went into those factories and you know, had the courage to go and do that work, and had the opportunity to go and do that work? Well, first of all, we won the war. As Woodrow Wilson explained, we won the war with the help of those women workers. Secondly, they helped win the right to vote. Thirdly, I believe they were responsible in a big way for improved health and safety conditions, not only for women, but also for men, because we got women into some of those leadership positions in the federal agencies. And the introduction of women into government agencies doing something other than secretarial work was a new thing during the war. There had never been a woman at the Department of Labor doing anything other than clerical work before Mary Anderson and Mary Van Cleek were hired to work at the head of the Women's Bureau. When World War II broke out, Mary Anderson was still there at the Labor Department, and she was still fighting for equal pay for women at that time. So this brings us up to Rosie the Riveter. This picture is not as familiar as the "We Can Do It" poster that we've seen so often. This is a Norman Rockwell illustration. I want you to notice Rosie has her foot on a book, and the title of the book is Mein Kampf. And she's got her lunch pail, and she's got protection on her wrist. She's got her sandwich. She's got facial protection. This visor that she's wearing has a little bit of a look of a halo, but that's her face protection that she could pull down. Why she would need both that and the goggles, I don't know, except that I think Norman Rockwell wanted to make her wearing a halo. She's got her little buttons that show, you know, safety awards and attendance awards and so forth, and that she's bought war bonds and all those things. She has massive arms. And if you look very closely right here in her pocket, you can see a little pink powder puff. So even though she's got those massive arms and she's very competent at her job, she's still asserting her femininity, or maybe Norman Rockwell is asserting her femininity, I don't know. But my thesis really is that when World War II came along, and women in much greater numbers, and not just working class women as in World War I, but middle class women, started working in munitions work in the war factories of the Second World War, the path was easier. The workplace was safer because of the strength and the courage and the hard work of the women in the First World War, the women workers, the welders, the railroad workers, the machine operators, the rivet passers and the rivet heaters, and the reformers in the government agencies. Because of the work of all of those women a generation earlier, the Rosies and the Wendy the welders of World War II were more effective, and they were safer, and they had an easier time of it because of what I call Rosie's mom, the earlier generation. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and what I would hope we can do here is, if any of you in the audience out there are on Zoom, that Jamie will bring us back to where I can see you, you can see me, and Jamie, shall I stop my screen share now?
Sure, thanks, Carrie.
Okay, and then we are going to try for some questions, discussion, if there's anyone out there. And if not, I have a few questions that normally get asked of me after I've given this talk, and we can consider those. But I'd much rather see what any of you out there have to say. People, if you want to tell stories about your own family histories or ask questions, we can do that. So we'll just see how this goes. I've never done this over Zoom before, and we'll see what happens.
So Carrie, thanks so much for that presentation.
You're welcome.
That was
Thank you.
incredible, very informative. We already have a few questions coming in through the chat. So,
good.
And people, of course, can raise their hands if they're on Zoom, and I will be able to open up your video or unmute you. But we do have some questions through the chat. So the first one, well, first we have a comment from Stephanie Smith who said, "Thank you. The history of women in the American workforce is fascinating. History courses should dive more deeply into the inequities of women across all settings in America."
Yes.
And then we have a question from Ina, which is, where did you get these amazing photos? I've never seen anything like them before.
Okay, good question. Well, some of the early ones, as I mentioned, are Lewis Hine photos, and I'm sure Ina has seen those photos. But the ones from the war, one of the things that the Women's Bureau at the Department of Labor did was they sent photographers around. They were sending inspectors around to the factories to monitor the conditions of the women who were working in these munitions plants. But they also sent photographers around, and they collected these photographs, and they were in the Department of Labor archives. When I first started looking for them, well, I found that they had been taken, and I first started looking for them. I also found that there had been a fire at the Department of Labor in the 1930s, and for a while I was afraid that they had been lost. But I did finally find them at the National Archive in College Park, Maryland. They have the Women's Bureau collection there, and they had all these wonderful photos. There are many more in the book, and there are many in the archive that I didn't use because obviously I didn't want the book to be all pictures. But that's where they came from. The Women's Bureau, as they were going around looking at the factories, monitoring the conditions and documenting the work. So some of them are clearly promotional, where they're trying to show off, okay, here's what we're doing, here's what women are doing. And they would create posters using these pictures to basically to show off the work of the women and of the Women's Bureau at the Department of Labor. But that's where I found them, and yeah, they're really wonderful. They're really fun, and much more can be learned by a closer study of them than what we were able to go into today.
We have a question from Chester, which is, you said that in the early 1900s, women who worked in factories had much lower fertility rates. Was this specifically due to chemicals or due to women's generally poor health from factory conditions?
That's a really good question. First of all, I want to clarify that I do not know if there are any studies that demonstrate that fact, what I call fact, on a really large scale. Let me tell you where I came up with that statement, and then I'll answer the question too. But I have done a longitudinal study of a particular cotton factory in Vermont in the 1880s. And I looked at by looking at the payroll records, I knew the names of the women and children who'd worked there, and looking at census records, I could look at the sizes of the family and how old the women were by finding them in the census records, and then I could look at the census records much later. So my own research into one factory in Vermont leads me to that particular statement with some confidence, because I looked at those women. The younger sisters tended, in a given family, tended to have sort of a normal number of children, and the older sisters tended to have no children or maybe one. And I think the reason for that is that the younger children didn't have to go into the factories. If you have a family with 8 or 9 children, once you get 2 or 3 of the older ones working, the younger ones can stay in school longer because you have some extra income coming in. So my finding was that the younger children, the younger girls, grew up 20 years later, they have more children. The older ones who went into the factories at such a young age did not. Now, I believe that other scholars have found the same thing, but I can't give you any numbers for sort of nationwide fertility. I think it was basically just the general health, that the stresses of working those long hours during the time that they were passing through puberty. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a physician, and I confess I have not read any studies by physicians of this phenomenon. There weren't a lot of chemicals in the factories that these women were working in the late say the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, they were working in textile mills. There's a lot of lung disease in textile mills because they're inhaling all the fibers, whether it's a wool factory or a cotton factory. A lot of lung disease, but they were not being exposed to the kinds of chemicals that women were then exposed to during the war, or that men were exposed to in the factories that were making chemicals and batteries and all that sort of thing. So I don't think it was that. I think it was more the general wear and tear on the health if you start working 12, 14-hour days when you're 12 or 13 years old and continue that up until, you know, you're 20 or something like that. I'm sorry, I can't give a better answer. That's the best I can do that, but it's a good question.
Thanks, Carrie. We have another question. Did the women who were put in charge by the Department of Labor to oversee working conditions for women in factories stay in those positions after most women workers were laid off?
Well, some did and some did not. As I mentioned, Mary Anderson did stay, and she was still at the head of the Women's Bureau in when World War II came around. Her colleague, Mary Van Cleek, did not stay, and I think that was by choice because she was a scholar. She had a career as a scholar, and that was really what she wanted to do. I don't think she wanted to stay in an administrative job. She wanted to get back to her research. So I think that's why she didn't stay. Now, in the railroad administration, the government had taken over the railroad only on a temporary basis during the war. So those women, the women who were running that organization, would definitely have lost their jobs because the administration was dissolved at the end of the war. And in the Department of Ordnance, I think it was the same thing. It was a temporary wartime situation. And I don't know for sure whether any of those women kept their jobs or not. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. I'm more confident of my statement about the Department of Labor, where a few of the women did stay because the Women's Bureau did persist for a very long time. And so the women who were running that, except for Mary Van Cleek, who left voluntarily, those women did stay in those jobs. I don't really know about the Ordnance Department, and I do know that the Railroad Administration was dissolved. Good question.
I don't know if Diane, if you have a question. I see that you unmuted. Do you have a question for Carrie?
Yes. Hi. Thanks. First of all, this is wonderful. Thanks so much for doing this. And
good. Thank you.
For the Poultney Historical Society for sponsoring the talk. When Mary Anderson and Mary Van Cleek were negotiating because women were so desperately needed in the workforce, is there any discuss, you know, they did what women often do, and that is not only look at their own needs, but look at like the whole social justice scenario. And so they fought for items that would also help men. However, it still seems to me that they left out important components of women. That's when they had the opportunity to say women need more money. That's when they had the opportunity to say women need some childcare or something like that, and they didn't go down that route, apparently, right?
Well, no, there were some efforts in that way too. They did want and did try to get equal pay for equal work. The problem with that, and it continued to be a problem for many decades, is that women often were not doing the same work as men. For example, you might be taught to run one particular milling machine, but you did not have all the skills of a full master machinist who could run all of the machines and knew how to set them up and so forth. So it was very difficult to say, okay, what's equal work? And on a riveting gang, the lower skilled jobs would be given to the women and the higher skilled jobs given to the men. So they had a real struggle with getting equal pay for equal work. That was absolutely one of their goals, and they did try to work toward that. I don't think there was much effort put into childcare. Other working conditions, though, they did work to getting separate restrooms, privacy in changing rooms, restrooms, and some of the factories had already begun doing that voluntarily. Some of the more enlightened companies like Jones and Lamson in Springfield, Vermont, was worked very hard to give the women comfortable restrooms and lunchrooms and things like that. At some of the federal arsenals, they created, again, it was sort of separate, but better than equal in some cases for the women, because the men didn't have nice restrooms with wicker furniture and a matron there making hot chocolate.
Okay.
Which they did in some of these other places. They would hire a matron who would be in the rest area, and if you needed first aid, you'd go to her, or you needed a cup of tea or hot chocolate and comfort, you would go to her. They would put flowers in. So it was really, again, quite sexist, but they were trying to create, and one factory owner said, if it takes geraniums to make women happy, I'll put geraniums in. So there was a lot going on that I wasn't able to cover. It's a really good question, Diane. The childcare issue is really a tough one, because I don't know, I could not uncover any evidence of anybody putting in on-site childcare. Your childcare really still, as far as I can tell, really still was your personal problem, and you had to have your mother or your sister or your neighbor. You had to kind of pool resources, and one woman on the night shift, one on the day shift, so they could watch each other's kids. That was a thing that I am not aware of any successes or even efforts by the Women's Bureau to really address that issue seriously. That doesn't mean they didn't do it, and I just didn't uncover it. You never know about that question until some other later scholar comes along and uncovers something that you missed. But there was more going on than just general health and safety. There were some of these other issues that women faced in terms of health and comfort, as they had to do a lot of work to save women from the harassment of the men in some of the factories, especially the big federal arsenals, where they were cat calls as they walked in and out of the factory. And there was one story of guys who would leave the bathroom door open when they went in to use it, just to embarrass the girl who was at the machine standing nearby. There was a big effort needed just to make the place safe. And so some of these other things that we look at today, they would have considered, kind of beyond the scope of what we can accomplish here in this crisis. Also, remember that we were in that war for 18 months. And it was a very intensive 18 months and a huge amount of work to do. And they did what they could.
Yeah. That's a short amount of time for sure. Yeah.
For making big changes.
Yeah. I know my aunt had to quit school after 8th grade to help her kid, the younger kids, because she was the oldest. So, my mom was the youngest, and my aunt never got to high school. Yeah.
Right. And that's not even that long ago. I mean, when was that?
See, Aunt Nellie was born in 1917. So, because her mom was clean houses and janitor for Westinghouse Electric in East Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah.
So I actually want to look at that photo sometime to see if my grandfather's in there, because he worked at Westinghouse Electric in East Pittsburgh as well around that time. But my Bapchi, my mother's mother, did work, and then my grandfather worked at Westinghouse Air Brake in Wilmerding, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, and then they had a little store that my Bapchi helped to run too. So they had to. This would have been in the late 20s, where she just would have had to quit school.
Yeah.
Or 1930, around 1930.
Yeah. One interesting thing that I have uncovered is that actually by that time, more families were letting their daughters stay in school, because as the pink collar, office jobs began to become more available, if a girl had a high school education, she had a better chance at getting that type of work, which paid better and was easier physically than the factory work or house cleaning and that sort of thing. So there were families that, when they could manage it, they let the daughters, even though they needed the income, they looked at the longer term. Well, if we let her stay in school till graduation, then she can get a job as a secretary. And that was considered a avenue for upward mobility. So if you could possibly not send the older daughters out to work, people began to do it. So the typewriter actually was an important force toward getting women to be better educated. Instead of dropping out, but obviously not in all families, because your own family, that didn't happen. Interesting. Diane, if you want to send me an email, I will see if I can get a good scan of that photo and send it to you. But you'll have to remind me and tell me how to get it to you.
Okay, I'm putting my email in the chat.
Okay, I'm not seeing. Oh, okay. I click on this chat thing. I will probably see it. Okay, notabene@crocker.com. Got it.
And I just sent it for email.
Okay. Okay, good. I will send you that picture.
Awesome. Thank you so
Good.
much.
Thanks for your questions, Diane. And I don't see any other questions popping up or anyone raising their hands, but I actually had a question, Carrie.
Okay.
I hadn't heard of the stock market crash in 1913, 1914. And that's certainly not as well known as the crash in 1929. So I was just wondering, why is that? It seems like it did play a role in all this, but I've never heard of it before.
Well, it was not, I think, as bad as the one in 29, but over the course of the 19th century, there was a real cycle of crash and then recovery and crash and recovery. And, it wasn't until well into the 20th century that economists and the government began to get some control and ability to manipulate things like money supply and interest rates and those kinds of things. That didn't happen until the 20th century. So the 19th century there was just these cycles of boom and bust all through the century. I don't know comparatively how bad that 1913 stock market crash was, compared to other things. I mean, because the stock market, of course, was much larger in 1929. And you'd had a bigger, I think that the 1920s was, a longer period perhaps of expansion in the economy than had happened previously. So I don't really know. I'm not a historian of economics, and I don't know that much about it, but that was just one of a whole series of recessions and crashes and bankruptcies and business closures and so forth. But it happened to happen right at that time, just before the war broke out. I don't know that it had any connection with unrest in Europe, because it was 1913, and but it was just a few months before the war broke out. Good question, though.
Yeah, thanks. And it looks like we just got another comment briefly from Rutland History saying, "Thank you, what a wonderful lecture." So,
oh, good. Well, thank you.
And if we don't have any more questions, I don't see any more, that might be wrapping it up for us. But thank you so much, Carrie. This has been incredible. And again, like with this year being so important as the 100th anniversary for the ratification of the 19th Amendment, I think that this talk was very fitting. And also that it's an election year. So we have that going for too. Good. But we really appreciate you working with us.
Well, I'm glad we could work it out. As I said, I wish we could be together, but maybe this brought some people who wouldn't have made it to the on-site thing. So thank you for doing it. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Right.
Okay.
Thanks. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Carrie.
So, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.